Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for tonight's panel discussion titled How the 1979 Soviet Invasion of Afghanistan Transformed U.S. Foreign Policy and Produced the War on Terror. This event was organized by the Center for Strategic Studies here at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. The center is directed by Monica Toft, professor of international politics, and is dedicated to producing policy-relevant research on strategy, international politics, and U.S. foreign policy. We're deeply grateful to the International Security Studies program here at Fletcher, the Department of History, and the Center for South Asian and Indian Ocean Studies at Tufts for sponsoring this event. My name is Arik Burakovsky. Until recently, I managed the Russia and Eurasia program here at Fletcher, and I've now transitioned to the Tufts University President's Office, where I serve as Associate Director of the newly launched Center for Expanding Viewpoints in Higher Education. Our mission is to help students, faculty, and the broader university community engage across ideological, cultural, and religious differences on a wide range of controversial public affairs and policy issues. That mission resonates strongly with tonight's gathering as we revisit one of the most consequential and contested conflicts of the late 20th century and trace its reverberations into our own time. This evening, we focus on the Soviet-Afghan War, which began with the Soviet Union's military intervention in December 1979 and raged for nearly a decade until February 1989. What at first appeared to be a regional conflict at the crossroads of South, Central, and West Asia quickly became a defining theater of the Cold War. The war drew in superpowers, reconfigured alliances, and unleashed an American covert operation on a scale hardly ever before attempted. For Afghanistan, it was a catastrophe, claiming more than 1 million lives and displacing millions more, leaving a legacy of destruction, instability, and radicalization. The broader consequences of the war, I think, are still with us. The internationalization of the Afghan jihad fundamentally reshaped militant Islam and set the conditions for transnational terrorism. The U.S. decision to pour billions into a covert proxy war supporting the Afghan Mujahideen altered the relationship between our intelligence agencies, the presidency, and Congress, raising enduring questions about the constitutional balance of powers. And the Soviet Union's ultimate defeat in Afghanistan foreshadowed its own unraveling, marking a pivotal turning point in the global order. It is especially poignant that we gather here today on September 11th. 24 years ago today, the United States suffered devastating terrorist attacks planned by al-Qaeda leaders, most notably Osama bin Laden, who had cut their teeth in the crucible of the Afghan jihad. The attacks of 9/11 were, in many ways, a direct legacy of the conflict that we are examining tonight. To reflect on the Soviet-Afghan War and the anniversary of 9/11 is to confront the long shadow it cast, from the battlefields of the 1980s to the war on terror of the 2000s and the 2010s, and even to the present moment with Afghanistan once again under Taliban control. We are fortunate to have with us 4 distinguished scholars to help us navigate this complex history and its implications. David N. Gibbs is professor of history at the University of Arizona. His research spans sub-Saharan Africa, Eastern Europe, and Afghanistan, where his archival work has challenged prevailing narratives about superpower motives and the ethical dimensions of military interventions. He is the author of Revolt of the Rich, How the Politics of the 1970s Widened America's Class Divide, and is currently working on a new book to be titled Guns, Butter, and the Politics of Permanent War, America at the End of the Cold War. And Elizabeth Leake serves as the Lee E. Dirks Professor in Diplomatic History at Fletcher. Her work focuses on the global histories of decolonization and Cold War dynamics, including award-winning studies of the Afghan-Pakistan borderlands, and her recent book, Afghan Crucible, The Soviet Invasion and the Making of Modern Afghanistan. She combines diplomatic history with local, regional, and transnational perspectives, exploring how Afghan statehood, colonial legacies, and neighboring states shaped the trajectory of the war. Michael J. Glennon is professor of constitutional and international law at the Fletcher School. Earlier in his career, he served as legal counsel to the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he has held numerous visiting and advisory positions, including at the Hague Academy of International Law and the Woodrow Wilson Center. His scholarship interrogates the balance of power between the executive, intelligence agencies, and legislative oversight, especially in fields like national security, covert operations, foreign policy law, through works such as National Security and Double Government, one of my favorites of his, and The Fog of War, Pragmatism, Security, and International Law. And finally, Aisha Jalal is the Mary Richardson Professor of History with a joint appointment between the History Department at Tufts and Fletcher. She directs the Center for South Asian and Indian Ocean Studies here at Tufts. She's a prominent Pakistani-American scholar whose work examines South Asian history with particular attention to political Islam, Muslim identities, and state formation. Her contributions include Partisans of Allah, Jihad in South Asia, and many more. The book examines how the Afghan Jihad transformed notions of legitimacy, war, and religious authority in the region. So each panelist will begin with opening remarks and frame their perspective. After that, I may ask them a couple of questions, and then we will open the floor to questions from all of you, our audience, as much as time will allow. And I encourage you to bring your insights and challenges to the conversation. This is an opportunity not only to reflect on the past, but also to consider how history's echoes continue to shape the dilemmas of U.S. foreign policy and global security today. So with that, our special guest, Professor David Gibbs.
Do I stand at the podium or?
You're welcome to stand at the podium, or you can sit down.
Is it okay if I stand at the podium?
Of course,
okay.
Please.
I'm more used to doing that. All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming. I really appreciate the invitation here. I particularly want to thank Arik for arranging this this panel. Looks like it's going to be a great panel. Actually, let me just take off my watch to make sure I stand within the time limit. I don't want to exceed the time limit. On December 24th, 1979, the USSR launched what became a massive invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. It inaugurated a new phase in the Cold War, the final terminal phase of the Cold War, one might say. It, as Arik noted correctly, it transformed not only international relations, but U.S. foreign policy, producing the largest single covert operation in the history of the Central Intelligence Agency up to that time. The United States began on a massive scale, backing the Mujahideen guerrillas who were battling the Soviet invaders. Afghanistan also proved to be something of a Pandora's box. Once you destabilize the country, once you opened Pandora's box, it's very hard to reverse the situation. It creates irreversible circumstances. And in this particular case, of course, once the Soviets were gone, Afghanistan did not return to stability or to obscurity. It became an incubator, as we all know, for the al-Qaeda terrorist organization, leading to the 9/11 terrorist attacks, killing 3,000 Americans. The war on terror, including the extended wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Afghanistan, of course, itself became now the American phase of the war in Afghanistan. 19 years in Afghanistan, depending on how you measure it, the longest war in American history. It's a matter of definition to some extent, but certainly one of the longest wars in American history. And so this is, a country that just keeps coming back, you might say, into the picture. And so one of the questions I'm going to look at here is how did it start? Where did it come from? And in particular, what I'm going to argue is that the United States essentially provoked the Soviet invasion and did so quite intentionally. And the evidence for this is really very compelling. This isn't really new evidence. I originally published it in an article, in an academic article in 2000, and it's been, discussed in some specialized venues many times, but it is something that I think is not that well known to the larger public. So it's worth reconsidering what happened here. And specifically, we have here is that Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was national security advisor to President Carter, by all accounts, the leading figure in the foreign policy of the Carter presidency, especially in the last 2 years. Brzezinski in 1998, after the Soviets withdrew, when he felt he could speak much more frankly, had an interview with a French magazine called Le Nouvel Observateur. The interview was in French, but I've had it translated and, as I said, published. And I'll read you the English translation. It's not very long, but it's so striking in its claims. I'll read it in full. I might add, by the way, there's some problems interpreting this, which I'll get to in a moment, as well as questions of reliability again. But first, let me just give you the facts here. And the question is being asked by a French journalist. Question: the former director of the CIA, Robert Gates, stated in his memoirs that the American intelligence services began to aid the Mujahideen guerrillas in Afghanistan 6 months before the Soviet invasion. In this period, you were national security advisor to President Carter. You therefore played a key role in this affair. Is this correct? Let me point out, by the way, that up until that time, the U.S. aid to the Mujahideen was claimed to have taken place after the Soviets invaded. You see, Afghanistan had a civil war going on in 78, 79 between a local communist party called the PDPA and the Mujahideen guerrillas, Islamist guerrillas who were opposing them. All right, the Soviets then invaded at the end of 1979, and the claim had always been made publicly that the U.S. did not intervene until after the Soviets invaded. The Soviets themselves, when they invaded, claimed they were responding to American meddling, but nobody believed them. All right. We now know that the Soviet claims were correct. And as he states, Robert Gates, the former CIA director, did state in his memoirs, I've checked this, that the decision to invade was made by President Carter in July 3rd, 1979. In other words, 6 months before the invasion. So there was a heavy element of public deception here. That must be stated. All right. Public deception was a key element of the picture here. And Brzezinski responds, yes. In other words, he's agreeing with everything the French journalist said. And by the way, in a moment, I'll get to this. It's not just that the U.S. meddled, but the question is motive. It was done with the motive of provoking an invasion. That's very important. Brzezinski, yes, according to the official version of history, in other words, the version told to the public at the time, CIA aid to the Mujahideen began during 1980. That is to say, after the Soviet army invaded Afghanistan on December 24th, 1979. But the reality, closely guarded until now, is completely otherwise. In other words, the public is deceived. Okay. The claims made by the Carter administration, including Brzezinski himself, were false, and he admits that. There is a tradition, and shall we say the darker side of realist theory, that public deception is an essential feature of any successful foreign policy, and clearly Brzezinski is very much part of that tradition, whether for better or worse. Indeed, it was July 3rd, 1979, that President Carter signed the first directive for secret aid to the opponents of the pro-Soviet regime in Kabul. And that very day, I wrote a note to the president in which I explained to him that, in my opinion, this aid was going to induce a Soviet military intervention. Okay, so they knew what they were doing, is what he was saying. We knew it would probably bring about an invasion, but we did it anyway, indicating they probably wanted the invasion. And it goes on. Question: despite this risk, you were an advocate of this covert action, but perhaps you yourself desired the Soviet entry into the war and looked for a way to provoke it? Brzezinski: it wasn't quite like that. We didn't push the Russians to intervene, but we knowingly increased the probability that they would. Let's look at that sentence again. It's a very interesting sentence because it's a single sentence divided by a comma, and the two clauses, the first and second, completely contradict each other. Okay, the first said, no, we didn't provoke it. The second says, yes, we provoked it. I read that as saying, yes, we provoked it. Question: when the Soviets justified their intervention by asserting they intended to fight against secret U.S. involvement in Afghanistan, nobody believed them. I was in my 20s at the time, and I remember I didn't believe it either. However, there was an element of truth in this. You don't regret any of this today? Brzezinski: regret what? The secret operation was an excellent idea. It had the effect of drawing the Russians into the Afghan trap, and you want me to regret it? So he was drawing the Russians into the Afghan trap, again, suggesting deliberate provocation, and that it wasn't a strategic setback for America, as it was claimed at the time. It was a strategic asset for America. All right. The day the Soviets officially crossed the border, I wrote to President Carter essentially, we now have the opportunity of giving the USSR its Vietnam War. Again, that gets to motive, payback for the Vietnam War, the Soviet support for the North Vietnamese in the Vietnam War. And again, it strongly suggests he was pleased about the opportunity to give them this Vietnam War, even if it meant provoking an invasion, which he did. Indeed, for almost 10 years, Moscow had to carry out a war that was unsustainable for the regime, a conflict that brought about the demoralization and finally the breakup of the Soviet Empire. Question: and neither do you regret having supported Islamic fundamentalism, which has given arms and advice to future terrorists? All right. Afghanistan, of course, did become a playground for terrorists. We know that. This was in 1998, however. They're speaking in 1998, 3 years before the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Brzezinski, what is more important in world history, the Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire? A bunch of agitated Muslims, or the liberation of Central Europe and the end of the Cold War. Okay. And then the French journalist, actually, I don't have the whole, I had 2 paragraphs I omitted there, but the French journalist goes on and expresses astonishment that he would belittle the significance of terrorism. And Brzezinski just insists he's very proud of the operation and he doesn't think the threat of terrorism was really that big a deal. Needless to say, 3 years later with the 9/11 terrorist attacks, this interview, well, in the first place, this interview, it was published in 2000 and it did get some attention, mostly very negative attention. He was publicly criticized for this interview and especially severely criticized after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, since he's ridiculing the significance of terrorism. Didn't look so good. And 14 years later in an interview, Brzezinski sort of retracted the interview. He implied he'd been misquoted. I'm going to have to say, I think that's very unlikely he was misquoted. And the reason is, if he was misquoted, he almost certainly would have gotten to the denial before 14 years later. It took him a long time to make the denial. And again, this is in one of the most influential papers in France. All right. Furthermore, he did it after he was publicly criticized. So he clearly had a motive to distance himself from an interview that just didn't look very good in retrospect. Finally, I want to note the interview has been corroborated by Lieutenant General William Odom, who served as military advisor to Brzezinski when he was at the National Security Council. He was, in fact, the first person to brief Brzezinski about the invasion when it occurred. And he later basically said that when Brzezinski heard about it, when he gave the briefing, his first reaction was to pump his fist in the air in triumph and say, "They've taken our bait. They have taken our bait," which is completely consistent, of course, with the interview in Le Nouvel Observateur, to the effect that basically he was proud of having provoked the invasion and was pleased that the invasion took place and that it was baited by him, all right, with U.S. aid to the Mujahideen. So I think this really has to be taken into account. There have been some feeble efforts, I think, to discredit the interview in Le Nouvel Observateur. There's an Irish historian named Conor Tobin, who in Diplomatic History wrote a whole article trying to discredit the interview. Honestly, he didn't come up with much. I think he focused mostly on the fact that Brzezinski basically denies having said these things. And second, which is not credible, since it didn't really grapple with the fact that General Odom has verified the key feature of his claims. All right, it's been corroborated. All right. Secondly, I think the article also focused on there was a minor error in the title, but again, this isn't very damaging, really, since the fact is that those who've published in newspapers in the era of print as opposed to internet publication know that the title was typically chosen at the last moment by the editor, not by the author. I was chosen to fit into the confines of the space that was allowed for the title. Among journalists, it was common knowledge that the title was the least reliable part of any article. So this doesn't seem very damning. And so really, we do have to accept the fact that the interview is probably a very credible record of what happened here. Furthermore, if one looks at Brzezinski's memoirs, published in 1983, he perfunctorily expresses regret about the invasion, but for the most part, spoke about it positively, that it enabled basically the hardline vision of U.S. foreign policy that he advocated to be accepted within the administration to become policy. And it also made his boss, President Carter, look strong. All right. And so really he basically said multiple times, not once, but multiple times, that he provoked the invasion and he's proud of it. So I think that is really the evidence we have to look at. I think furthermore, we have to look at something else here, which is much of what had been said of Afghanistan at the time turned out to be bogus if you look at declassified documents. It was very much said at the time, including by Brzezinski, that the Soviets invaded Afghanistan because it's the most strategically important, or one of the most strategically important places in the world. That's why they invaded it. It's very close to the Persian Gulf. It's a stepping stone to the Gulf, to the Indian Ocean. And that's why they invaded it. Everybody accepted it. I think mostly because very few people knew very much about Afghanistan, including at the policy level. But if you look at the documents, the declassified documents from the Foreign Relations of the United States and elsewhere, from the 1950s and 60s, what you see is that over decades, American officials said again and again and again, Afghanistan is of no strategic importance to the United States. The territory is too rugged, it is too underdeveloped, it is too far from the sea, and Afghanistan is of no importance. Came up again and again. In 1973, in one of the very rare instances where a major US newspaper had an extended article on Afghanistan, the Wall Street Journal had an article entitled, title was, "Do the Russians covet Afghanistan? Question mark. If so, it's hard to figure out why." And the article noted Afghanistan is a vast expanse of desert waste. That's what it said. And ridiculed the idea that Afghanistan could be of any strategic importance. And again, that echoed views in the US foreign policy establishment expressed in documents from the 50s onward to the mid 70s. Okay. And so we have here is really very consistent. Afghanistan was of no strategic importance at all. One more point, by the way. During this period as well, there was a very distinguished political scientist at Columbia University who studied and published on international relations very extensively. And in all of his writings, I've never been able to find a single mention. Well, that's not true. One single mention I found of the country Afghanistan. It was mentioned in passing in a laundry list of countries on how they voted on some issue at the United Nations. Other than that mention, there was no mention of Afghanistan at all, as far as I can tell, or certainly no significant mention. The name of that political scientist is Zbigniew Brzezinski. Obviously, Brzezinski didn't see it as a very important country, and that's clearly reflected in his writings. And then when he claimed afterward it was important, it must be viewed as a propaganda invention rather than a reality. Now let's go to the issue of the Soviet view of Afghanistan. I'm running out of time here, I'm sorry to say, so I'll have to wrap this up rather quickly. But the Soviet view of Afghanistan had been that it was of some strategic importance because it was on their borders. I'm relying here to some extent on US documents and how they viewed the Soviet Union. From the 1950s onward, the Soviets became the largest supplier of foreign aid to Afghanistan. And also they trained Afghan officers at Soviet military academies. American observers noted they were doing this because they wanted a stable Afghanistan because they're concerned about their southern frontier. And they seem to have no interest in a communist Afghanistan. Much of what the Soviets said about Afghanistan to American officials and believed by American officials was that they characterized the Afghans as too backward for socialism, too hyper-religious, and they had a very negative view of a particular brand of Islam that was very negative from the Soviet standpoint. Elizabeth Leake had talked in her book on how the Soviets were to some extent echoing cliches from British colonialism about the backward Afghans and so on. And indeed they were. The significance of these cliches, though, is that the Soviets did not feel Afghanistan was anywhere near ready for socialism and didn't want a socialist Afghanistan. There was a communist party in Afghanistan called the PDPA, but there's really no serious evidence the Soviets ever wanted to bring it to power. It came to power in 1978, okay, for what appears to have been an internal coup without external Soviet orchestration. And it came to power, and then essentially its bad conduct by the PDPA alienated the local population, who then rose up in a revolt. The revolt led by what were called the Mujahideen guerrillas, drew the Soviets into Afghanistan to support the Afghan communist government because they were afraid of an Islamic extremist government in Afghanistan. Okay, But the Soviet documents, by the way, are now available. I myself do not speak Russian, but they've been translated by the Woodrow Wilson Center, and the vast quantity of declassified Soviet documents. In the early 90s, the Soviet archives were pretty much open. And what they show is remarkable, actually. During the period 78-79, when there was a civil war, but before the Soviets invaded, the Afghan communists again and again and again begged the Soviets to send in regular Soviet forces, saying our soldiers are not reliable. And again and again and again and again, the Soviets refused and said we cannot take the risk of sending in our own forces. This was emphasized very strongly. I think what changed their mind was two things. First of all, the head of the Communist Party of Afghanistan, Hafizullah Amin, began talking in late 1979 publicly in an interview with Los Angeles Times about broadening their base of support to include other countries beyond the Soviet Union, which of course meant hinting at a turn to the United States. The Soviets, truthfully, I think when he gave that interview, that was his death warrant. The Soviets later had him assassinated when they invaded the country. But there was a second factor, and that was the supply of aid to the Mujahideen guerrillas authorized by Carter, discussed in that interview, which increased Soviet paranoia that the Soviets were going to use Afghanistan as a base for destabilization. They probably exaggerated American willingness to, occupy Afghanistan or set up bases. That was probably an overstatement of what American intentions were. But the Soviets didn't know that, and their paranoia led to the decision to set aside the reservations they previously had and invade the country and occupy it for almost 10 years. It's worth noting, by the way, that if you read the memoirs of Diego Cordovez, who was the UN-appointed mediator who eventually brokered the exit of the Soviets from Afghanistan in 1988, he talked about in his memoirs how one of the major factors that delayed the Soviet exit was American foreign policy, that he points out that American policy was publicly to encourage a Soviet exit, but privately to do everything they could to block the Soviet exit, to torpedo negotiated efforts aimed at giving the Soviets a face-saving way of leaving, with the intention of keeping them in Afghanistan for as long as possible and to take casualties for as long as possible, to give them, in Brzezinski's words, their Vietnam, and to keep the Vietnam going as long as possible, underscoring once again very strongly the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan was not a setback for Western security. It was seen as an asset for Western security. It was seen not as a bad thing, but as a good thing, all right, completely contradicting the public statements that were being made at the time. One of the things I do want to note here is that this all took place in the context of America's defeat in Vietnam. The mid-1970s was a period of huge anguish in American foreign policy, that we'd lost a major war. For a major power to lose a war is a big deal, all right? And that hugely discredited the foreign policy establishment. It led to a change in a much milder foreign policy that was reluctant to intervene. Military spending went to its lowest level of the Cold War as a percentage of GDP. And there was a massive effort a lobbying effort made by vested interests to try and overturn that and bring American foreign policy back to assertive militarism. Right. There's also the growth of what has been called the neoconservative movement among intellectuals, which argued for kind of an Israeli model of unrestrained and unapologetic American militarism. Brzezinski was very much part of the neoconservative movement. I've gone through the papers of much of the neoconservative movement, in particular the papers of someone named Eugene Rostow, who headed the Committee on the Present Danger, a major lobby group in favor of raising military spending during this period. And it really was a fascinating read to look at the private papers, and that there was a heavy emphasis upon public deception. There was a fear that the public was not ready for raised military expenditures. The public was so angry about the defeat in Vietnam that the public was not eager for new foreign ventures or new military spending. The military was discredited. And so the question being raised by people like Rostow, being discussed in private, was how do we persuade the public? And the answer he gave is what we need is something to shock the public, something so shocking, okay? It would shock them into accepting higher military spending. The term he used is what we need is a Pearl Harbor moment, a Pearl Harbor moment. That was the term he used. Afghanistan was that Pearl Harbor moment. It led to a sea change in U.S. foreign policy, a major increase in military spending, a reinvigoration of the Central Intelligence Agency and the military. It's important to emphasize that this shift did not occur under Reagan. It occurred under Carter. All right. I think there's a lot of mythology, basically, about a clean break between a moderate, maybe liberal Carter and a very sort of conservative militarist Reagan. That's not really accurate. The shift occurred under Carter. I just wrote a book basically on the 1970s, and it basically argued that in almost every respect of both economic policy and foreign policy, virtually every major point we attribute to Reagan actually had its origins with President Carter, who was a very different president, I think, than people realize. Final point I want to ask is, I'm going way over time. I'm very sorry. I finally just want to conclude basically that whatever judgment you want to make on the Afghan war, whether it was a success as Brzezinski sees it or as a failure, as a disastrous failure perhaps, one thing that is very clear at this point is whatever judgment one wants to put on the desirability of the Soviet invasion, it was clearly a provoked invasion. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And our next panelist is Professor Elizabeth Leake.
Super. Is this on? Okay. All right. I've slightly lost track of how much time are we supposed to be speaking for?
So can we do about 10 minutes for the panelists?
I'll do my best. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. And it's both fun and daunting, and to be talking about Afghanistan, again, particularly the Soviet invasion, having written a book about it that was published several years ago. I think I'm going to be offering perhaps a slightly different perspective and different take on the Soviet war, or what I actually tend to frame as the Afghan civil war, and in terms of thinking about its consequences globally, as well as its impacts for U.S. foreign policy. Just a couple of observations. I don't know how many Afghan experts we have here in this room, but especially for our historians in this room, I think one point that's worth thinking about, if we're thinking about the 20th century, if we're thinking about sort of global conflicts that have been written about extensively, one of the things that's really striking, as David has just made very clear, is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan is a really critical moment for both the 20th and the 21st centuries in terms of international relations. But what's really noticeable is that if you go to kind of any bookstore, you'll see dozens upon dozens of books about the history of the U.S. war in Vietnam, and very, very few on the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. There's a really remarkable disconnect in terms of the ways that these two crises have been traded within the discipline. But what's important with Afghanistan, though, and this is something that's really come to light more recently, is that the events there really do fit into broader patterns of the global Cold War, right? So in the last few decades, historians have really recognized the Cold War as fundamentally a violent conflict, and one that played out across much of the so-called third world, rather than being an ideological sort of economic competition between the US and the Soviet Union, broadly fought in the North Atlantic and Western Europe. So Afghanistan fits into this broader milieu, but why is it important, and kind of what are some of the takeaways that I think are important for us here at the Fletcher School, at Tufts, and in terms of thinking, I suppose, about September 11th, but also about thinking about the past. One of the things that I think we need to really recognize with the Afghan crisis and the civil war is that it was a crisis that was fundamentally both global and local at once. So I think it's a story, it's a history that we cannot tell simply by focusing on great power politics or decision-making that was taking place in the United States or the Soviet Union in DC or Moscow. It's also a conflict in which we have to take Afghan actors very seriously, thinking about what were their ideas, what were their motivations, and how and why it was that they came to clash with each other. We have to think about regional actors, most prominently the role of Pakistan, but also certainly the roles of India, Iran, and China as well. And we also then kind of have to think about how do these different layers, how do these different spaces interact with each other? There's been a real tendency, particularly in terms of the ways that sort of media pundits discuss Afghanistan, and this has been really the case since 2001 onwards, that Afghanistan often gets framed as being a space rather than a people, right? The so-called graveyard of empires. In other words, it's a space where foreign powers get to intercede or intervene and shape local dynamics. And this is a really problematic reading, I think, of the history of any place, right? People have agency and actions. And this is something that we need to think about, and that's what I really want to emphasize briefly here. So a couple of points I want us to just sort of think about, some of which are specific to the Soviet invasion, but some of which I think have broader resonances. So firstly is the importance of local actors. So certainly, I think firstly we need to take seriously the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, an organization that actually sort of ironically was founded at Kabul University, which was the university which was built by USAID. So there's a bit of a circular relationship here because the US was actually quite involved financially in Afghanistan from the 1950s onwards. But the PDPA thought carefully about what was communism, what is Marxism, why should it be appealing to and appropriate for Afghanistan? How can we tailor these ideas to local settings? They didn't necessarily have great answers or even answers at all to some of these questions, but these were political debates that were taking place very actively within the party and within the different cells that they tried to establish across the country. Likewise, it's important to recognize that the Afghan Communist Party very actively tried to develop links with other local communist and socialist parties across South Asia, the Middle East, and further abroad. So in other words, these Afghan communists, they're not just these parochial backwards tribesmen, right? They're intellectuals who are thinking carefully about global political dynamics and currents, but also local circumstances that they would like to see improved. The same thing holds true then for a lot of the resistance groups that end up coming together to fight against the communists. I think it's really important to remember that we often use the word mujahideen as a sort of shorthand for talking about the Afghan resistance to the Communist Party. But in practice, the Mujahideen are incredibly diverse. Some groups were much more politically moderate, even secular. Some were much more religiously radical, if we want to use that term. But there are really significant differences among these different groups, and the Mujahideen really ends up becoming a coalition of 7 main political parties. And the even notion of these Afghan political parties, some of which are espousing various forms of political Islam, some of which are espousing a form of monarchism, some of which are thinking about a constitutional democratic system based in the United States. The very fact that these political parties emerge out of this crisis and are interacting with each other and are trying to engage with the United States demonstrates the modern nature of Afghan politics and the ways in which, again, Afghans, in this case, across a very broad intellectual milieu, were thinking about what does it mean to be modern? What is the role of Afghanistan? What is the role of the Afghan state for its citizens? Interestingly, both the communists and the kind of more radical Islamist groups all focus on and agree on the same land reform policies as seeing what they think needs to happen within Afghanistan. But they're also thinking about how should Afghanistan portray itself in the world? How can it assert its legitimacy? It's important to remember that for many African and Asian states that became independent in the 20th century, Afghanistan is not seen as being backwards. It's seen as being at the vanguard of the decolonization movement because of its formal independence and because of the ways it manages to attain independence in its foreign policy during the Third Anglo-Afghan War of 1919. In other words, at the end of the First World War, it's one of the only non-European states that can claim to be fully independent and to have attained its independence. So it's really framed actively in this way. You see this, for example, with Sun Yat-sen and the way he describes Afghanistan. Likewise, you see it in terms of Lenin and his early recognition of Afghan sovereignty. So local actors are really important. And not only that, then ideas matter. And we really need to take these ideas seriously. And this is, I suppose, where I would offer a critique, a point of many, of US foreign policy in relationship to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which is the United States, the government, and you see this across the CIA, you see this across the Carter and Reagan administrations, and you see it across different sort of departments within the government. The United States government never took the Mujahideen seriously. It never took seriously the political parties. It never took seriously their ideas or their aspirations for Afghanistan. And as a consequence, it never tried to actively decipher and decide which political organizations or parties perhaps it should support as being the successor to a war-torn Afghanistan and the end of the Communist Party. So the United States had many opportunities because of the ways it was funneling money into the covert operations to shape Afghanistan's political trajectory, and instead they chose not to. There's a broader trend that happens in the late 1970s and the 1980s, certainly with U.S. policy towards Afghanistan, but you see it too in terms of U.S. policy towards the Iranian Revolution and other events across South Asia and the Middle East, which is that the United States simply does not take political Islam seriously as a social and political force. And you can see this, the CIA documents are especially revealing in this sense, in terms of the ways in which they keep referring to Islam as a sign of a backwards society. And it's people trying to reject modernity. And it's like, basically, they're like, oh, Islam's like these people's comfort blanket. There's no taking seriously the ways in which political Islam very actively evolved and diversified across the 20th century, and the ways in which there were different Islamic systems of thought that thought about politics in new, modern, and sometimes radical ways. So the US really fails to acknowledge that. And that's one of the key reasons why there are so many linkages then between what happens in the 1980s, the 1990s, and post 2001. The kind of the United States approach to, approach to political Islam, or I should say lack thereof, would be one of the reasons I would argue that the United States lost its war in Afghanistan in 1978 and 1979. This is a 40-year plus war, not one that started in 2001. And the US had the opportunity earlier on to engage with and deal with some of these questions. The other reason I say this in terms of the United States sort of role in all of this is also because of the ways in which it represents, or actually refuses to represent, Afghan interests at the United Nations in terms of discussions about Afghanistan's future. The Soviet invasion and then the UN negotiations that lead to the Geneva Accords, by which the Soviets agreed to withdraw from Afghanistan in February 1989, who had a seat at those bargaining table? It was the PDPA, the Afghan communists, it was the government of Pakistan, it was the Soviet Union, it was the United States, right? So if we think about the ways in which the UN works, it's generally the arena for nation states. It is not necessarily, and almost always, it is almost exclusively an arena for nation states and not for state claimants. So what this meant in the 1980s was that the United Nations would not allow representatives of the different Afghan resistance parties from participating in discussions of what a post-Soviet withdrawal Afghanistan should look like, because they were not formally state representatives. So what happens in Afghanistan raises a really important question, and we're seeing some of these questions again being replicated now, whether we're looking at the Middle East, whether we're still looking at Afghanistan, whether we're looking certainly too with thinking about Russia and Ukraine. Who gets a seat at the bargaining table, who is seen as a legitimate political actor, and whether you have to be formally recognized as a state actor is a really critical issue for international relations, but it's also a category that often belies reality, right? And we see this particularly in war-torn countries. And we also saw this then in Afghanistan, if we think about the Doha peace talks, and in terms of the ways in which the Taliban and the then Afghan government, kind of who was involved and who could be participating and how, but equally who could not. So this question of representation becomes really important. In the case of 1980s in Afghanistan, this becomes even more of a situation because the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the civil war that began right before it provoked one of the largest refugee crises the modern world has ever known, one that persists until today. So the human consequences of this crisis were so vast, yet those refugees, again, also had no representation in the discussions about what sort of government needed to be put in place, what sort of infrastructure needed to be built in order for millions and millions of refugees to return. So I think these things are important. The one last point I want to end on then is just to think about the ecological consequences. So right after the Geneva Accords were signed, UN officials were sent throughout Afghanistan to do a survey to gauge kind of what quality of life, or kind of how much life could be supported in the provinces across Afghanistan. And they came back to the UN and concluded, this is 1989, that none of the provinces could fully support Afghan livelihoods. Too many villages had been destroyed, roads had been mined, orchards destroyed. So kind of thinking about the ecological devastation of this war is really critical. And for us today, it's even more critical then in terms of thinking about the earthquake that has just happened in Afghanistan and thinking about these questions about rebuilding, and thinking about the sheer level of destruction that Afghanistan has undergone over the past 40 years. And in turn, then thinking about what level of rebuilding is actually needed. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a reason to or to not recognize the Taliban, but I think we need to think about the ecological consequences of war. And I think also then in terms of what I've been saying about taking ideas seriously, it's also worth, I think, Western powers in particular, thinking critically about what the Taliban is, how it's framing itself, and how it may or may not try to engage with the international community.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Next panelist is Professor Michael Glennon.
Hello. Is this on?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I want to first thank Eric for inviting me to be here today and make three quick observations. First, underscoring the importance of what you just heard from David Gibbs, which is not, I think, widely appreciated. Second, recollecting my own personal experience in what may have been, and I put a question mark in front of this, what may have been the causal result of the events that he described. I was present in Washington for 9/11. And third, talk very briefly in summary form about the long-term consequences of the 9/11 attacks that we're living with to this day. I think that the comments that David made go beyond what most people think of as blowback, which is typically identified as the consequence of American involvement with the Mujahideen in supporting them against the Soviets following the invasion of Afghanistan. What he's described is something very different and far more troubling in terms of blowback, and that is the possibility that the United States tried to lure the Soviets into that invasion. Now, there are two questions here. First, whether the United States, and specifically Zbig Brzezinski, Carter's national security advisor, tried to do that. And second, there's a counterfactual. Would the Soviets have undertaken the invasion but for Brzezinski's and the CIA's efforts to make trouble for them in Afghanistan? I want to focus on the first question because I was there at the time. As Arik mentioned, I was the legal counsel to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 1979. At the time, these efforts of Brzezinski occurred. Now, David has talked about the reaction of Brzezinski when he was informed of the invasion. They've taken the bait, he told his military aide, and then a few years later said to the French newspaper, "We did not push the Russians into intervening, but we did knowingly increase the chances that they would do so." A very damning admission, which he tried to wiggle out of, but as David pointed out, it seems to be an accurate admission against interest. David didn't mention a few other items of evidence indicating that there was indeed an American effort to lure the Soviets into doing this. Ed Luce, in his current best-selling biography of Brzezinski, reports that the KGB believed that Afghan President Amin was on the CIA's payroll, that Amin had indeed been a student at Columbia when Brzezinski taught there, and that they may have known each other from that period. In February of 1979, 10 months before the invasion, Brzezinski asked the CIA to draw up options, and in July, pushed through a presidential finding that authorized $695,000, which was a big sum of money in those days, to aid the Afghan rebels. This was all done over the objections of Warren Christopher and the State Department, whom Brzezinski said was filled with mush heads. Now, none of this was briefed to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 1979. None of this was briefed to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 1979. I would have known it if it had been briefed to the committee. I don't think the chairman, Frank Church, knew about this. I don't think the Senate Intelligence Committee knew about it. I was in constant contact with the staff director of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Bill Miller, who subsequently came to teach here, curiously. And we talked about all kinds of matters like this. He never mentioned it. I don't think the Intelligence Committee knew it. Had they known it, I think they would have shared that information with me. It's very troubling that this kind of activity can be undertaken without congressional oversight committee's knowledge. Second, at an even deeper level, the lesson for us Fletcher students of international relations has to do with second and third order effects. Zbig Brzezinski thought he could socially engineer major geopolitical events to come out in a way favorable to American interests. He was not able to look into the hazy future and anticipate the possibility that what happened in Washington 24 years ago today would be the unintended consequence of his action, or perhaps, as David suggested, he would think that the demise of the Soviet Union was a prize worth getting for the small price of the sacrifices of 9/11. I remember 9/11. I sat that morning 24 years ago in the Wilson Center, where I was a fellow with, ironically, Lee Hamilton, who became the co-chair of the 9/11 Commission. Curiously, obviously, neither he nor I, watching this on television, had any notion that he would chair this historical after-action review of what was going on. I think it's fair to say that we all, and Washington generally, went through phases of grief, beginning with denial, moving to panic, moving to anger. The denial occurred as we were watching the planes fly into the buildings and listening to reports that the fourth plane, which you'll recall crashed in Pennsylvania, was heading back towards Washington to potentially crash into the Capitol or the White House. I say we were in denial because the White House at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue was a 5-minute walk just down the street from the Wilson Center at 1300 Pennsylvania Avenue. If we had had our wits about us, we would not be sitting there watching television. We would have gone down to the basement. But no, we were sitting there absolutely stunned by what we were watching. Do you know, the last time that the United States military suffered the kind of losses that it suffered when the third plane hit the Pentagon was in 1876, when the Sioux Indians wiped out General Custer's 7th Cavalry. That's how anomalous this event was in American history. The denial phase, therefore, quickly turned to panic. In Washington over the following days, you couldn't sleep at night because there were constantly sirens going off. Constant sirens. The restaurants were empty. The streets were empty. Everyone was bracing for another attack. 5 days later, there was another attack. People have forgotten. 5 people were killed as a result of the anthrax attack. It was commonly assumed in Washington these things are related. No one knew when and where the terrorists would strike next. Indeed, it was thought they were among us. This quickly changed to anger. 2 days after the attacks, I sat in a restaurant in a high-rise in Arlington, virtually overlooking the smoldering side of the Pentagon where this plane had hit, with 2 senior members of the intelligence community. We were virtually alone in this restaurant. And I remember distinctly, and these were, not hotheads by any means. They were cool dudes. One of them suggesting to the 2 of us, if I had my druthers, we would blitz the Iraqi oil fields. So you look back on this, what? Iraq, as you know, had nothing whatsoever to do with the 9/11 attacks. But that was the mentality in Washington at the time. The phrase, drain the swamp, didn't refer then to getting rid of the bureaucracy. It referred to draining the global swamp of those countries that could be a base for the attack we had just suffered, because no one knew where it came from. So the thinking, bipartisan thinking in Washington at the time was, this can't happen. We have the most powerful military in the world. Madeleine Albright had just said to Colin Powell, why do we have this powerful military if we're not going to use it? The bipartisan feeling was, let's use it to eliminate these countries one at a time. Iran, Iraq, North Korea, Libya, that could have been a base for these attacks, and Afghanistan, of course. So this led to the consequences that I will elaborate in the Q&A period, if you like, that are with us to this day. The courts have become friends of the management of the national security state. They defer and defer and defer and dismiss challenges to abuse of constitutional rights on every available technicality. Political question doctrine, the state secrets privilege, standing, ripeness, mootness. Only a tiny handful of individuals who suffered a deprivation of their constitutional rights have recovered a dime in damages in judicial actions challenging executive wrongdoing. Congress has become a lapdog. The AUMF that was enacted 5 days after the attack continues to serve as a authorization for executive actions. 24 years later, it's been used by 4 succeeding presidents to use force in 22 different countries. Yesterday, this afternoon, actually, the House of Representatives repealed 2 of the AUMFs concerning the authorization to use force against Iraq. But the Al-Qaeda AUMF from the 9/11 episode remains on the books, and the Pentagon is not going to give that up. And of course, the executive continues the practice of believing that it can simply wave a semantic wand over a fact situation and label someone a terrorist and thereby change the substantive rules that apply under international and constitutional law concerning the use of force. And if you doubt that, look at what happened in the Caribbean off the shores of Venezuela only last week. And when confronted with the possibility that this may have violated international law and constituted a war crime, Vice President of the United States said, "I don't give a shit." Now, I'll just conclude by suggesting, maybe war crimes and Nuremberg and the fact that we hanged 10 Nazi defendants in 1946 for war crimes, maybe that's irrelevant. But if it is, the way that law is taught at the Yale Law School these days is unrecognizably different than it was in the United States in 1946. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And last but not least, Professor Aisha Jalal.
Well, thank you very much. I think listening to the panelists, the key question that I have in my mind is whether America has learned anything at all from the Afghan war and the lessons of that war, because it seems that they are determined to keep on repeating. So what is it about the policy-making world that acts on, it basically acts before it thinks things through? And here I just want to go back to 24 years ago, because I was here and I witnessed the impact of 9/11, which you described very eloquently. And one of the things, everything we've talked so much about 9/11, there's very little that one could add. But one aspect that I think is often forgotten is that after the 9/11 attacks, there was a surge of goodwill for the United States of America, something that I think is extremely important to underscore in this environment where there is no goodwill, at least in areas that I have visited of late, which is Asia, and America is seen to be as a rogue state, unfortunately. So I just wanted to go back to that. The goodwill that one saw and the debate about the imminent US attack. I was, of course, of the view that the Americans I could understand the political compulsions of wanting to go and bomb the post office from where the attacks had come. But I was very skeptical about the chances of any success. And I have eyewitnesses on October 7th, when I heard the news, I said, America will rue this day. So I think that not being able to learn from history is something that has to be thought about very hard, about not just, why policymakers are, their knee-jerk reactions, why they don't learn from history. But I think it was commonsensical for me, having seen what had happened in Afghanistan really from 1979 onwards, that this is not going to succeed. So I think that's one point I wanted to make. And I think that the tragedy for Afghanistan is undoubted. But I do want to point out that in addition to Afghanistan, another country was ruined. And that happens to be a country called Pakistan. And very little is really made of that. Thanks to America, a much hated military dictator not only managed to extend his stay in Pakistan to become the longest ever military dictator in Pakistan's history. He survived for 11 years. He was an international pariah when the Soviets invaded, and overnight he became the leader of a frontline state. But it wasn't just that. It was thanks to the CIA and the billions of dollars that came in that the Pakistani military, which has always dominated Pakistan's politics, became so entrenched that the civil-military balance was settled. And I think that that's not acknowledged adequately when doses of democratic mantras are passed out. So I think that it's really important to realize the stranglehold that the Afghan war created as far as the civilian leadership was concerned. And any hope of genuine democracy in Pakistan went down the drain. But I think that what is, and the consequences have carried on. Pakistan was, I mean, the parallel arms and drugs economy that was fueled by the Afghan war and where the army played a direct role in profiteering. I think that has really sort of sunk the country in ways that people don't understand or don't wish to understand, because obviously America is too busy with its other wars. But what I do want to point out is that in this post 9/11 war situation in which Pakistan was a frontline state, but even with its end, you know, with, I mean, the tragic departure of the United States with all the fumbling and mistakes that were made, it's an unforgettable moment that the world can't sort of get its head around, that you spend $2.6 trillion, you sink that money, you go and attack the Taliban and then end up handing it over to them, basically, or abandoning, scuttling. And I think what is not realized is that America just didn't just scuttle and leave. America left ammunitions worth billions in Afghanistan, which the Taliban are now using against Pakistan. And the Pakistani military is not as well equipped as the Taliban are in the utilization. So the Taliban are back. And so I really think that what we need to talk about is why we don't learn, or do we not want to learn? And if Professor Gibbs's point about provocation is to be believed, then is America's policy to provoke, to attack, to destabilize? If that is it, then maybe we've got the wrong end of the stick, because I don't really understand why. I mean, unless America ceases to be a rational power, how you can make sense of any of this?
Thank you, Professor Jalal.